Joining us now is author and strategist Alastair Campbell, and from Brighton by Spiked online columnist Inaya Folarin-Iman. Good morning to you both. A festive morning to you both.
Morning.
Alastair, as we're heading into New Year, well, we've got some bleak news, haven't we, about COVID? The UK has hit a record number of COVID cases, with more than 41,000 reported on Monday. Is a lockdown the only way forward, a national lockdown?
Well, my worry is that we're kind of heading to that without the government being frank about the scale of the challenge that we're now facing. And those figures you just read, if you go back to when the country was in pretty much full lockdown, then day after day, ministers were coming before the public and explaining what we should be doing, how we should be approaching it. And these figures are way beyond that. I was watching a French news bulletin last night, and they were having an agonised debate in France because they're up to 8,000 a day. Well, we're 5 times that. Now, I understand why I think the very word lockdown sort of fills the whole country with dread. But actually, most of us are living in a form of that now. And so, look, I just fear that the whole story of COVID, I'm afraid, and I know we're going to talk about Brexit later, I think it's the same there too, is the government isn't straight with the people about the reality of what's going on and presents the world as it wants it to be, schools being a good example, as opposed to how it really is. And this is clearly, this variant in particular is pretty much, it seems to me, still out of control.
Inaya, what do you make of these figures and how the government is dealing with the situation at the moment? Obviously, we know, we've just had Christmas, we've got New Year's Eve still to come. These figures could still get worse.
Yeah, I think that, these figures are really sad and frustrating, but we have to also remember that cases doesn't necessarily kind of equate to hospitalizations. And so many of the people that have cases may not actually be kind of seriously ill or have any overt symptoms whatsoever. But of course, there's a concern that many hospitals have expressed that this may add pressure and potentially overwhelm them. But we also have to remember that part of the overwhelming situation that hospitals are going through is also dealing with the backlog from a lot of kind of cancellations, from non-urgent appointments and treatments from the kind of first lockdown. And so there are significant consequences to a lockdown also that often actually have longer term impacts that we might have to feel months and months down the line. So I don't think that there's any kind of perfect road to dealing with the situation.
When you talk about that, what are you referring to? Mental health issues long term? Is that what you mean?
So, for example, kind of delayed appointments for various treatments that happened earlier, in the pandemic. And so even oftentimes when we do have to lock down, that often means that we have issues when it comes to other treatments that are non-COVID related. And therefore, there's no actual locking down and taking these stringent measures often has other kind of adverse effects that we have to deal with later on.
And so when we look at the provisions that are in place, we're hearing today that the Nightingale hospitals, a number of them are being dismantled, and yet we're hearing the stories about hospitals at capacity, they're running out of oxygen. There seems to be some sort of mismatch here between the need and the provision that's there for it.
Well, looking at those pictures now, you do wonder whether the whole Nightingale operation, where Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock and getting the army involved, and it did seem at the time like an extraordinary success story that these hospitals were kind of created in places like the Excel Centre there out of absolutely nothing, and they've not been used. And what it makes me worry is that was just a gigantic and incredibly expensive kind of PR operation, which they couldn't then take through because they lacked the resources actually to man them, to put people in there, nurses and doctors and carers, that can then take care of the patients. And, I know a lot of people who work in the health service who I think have done an incredible job, but are really getting to the point of absolute total frazzlement about the pressures that they're under, some of which we heard in your bulletins, and I just pointed out there, now catching up on some of the consequences of the lockdown. And I do think, by the way, you raised mental health there. I think the mental health consequences of this pandemic, in so many ways, we've not even begun to reckon on what they are. And I don't believe the government has a strategy for that either.
Yeah, Alastair, you've talked very openly on television about your battles with depression. I think we've met a few times on the sort of mental health campaigning circuit. Where do you stand then? Because lockdown does seem to work in decreasing COVID cases, but it doesn't seem to take into consideration that there are bigger consequences in terms of our mental health. I mean, some of the figures we see, 10 million more people are seeking new help in terms of mental health or additional help. 10 million, I mean, that's just such a huge number. And that's the sort of thing that's going to be happening, affecting the country for 10, 20 years' time, if those cases, those people aren't getting access to mental health treatment. Where do you stand on it, though? Because lockdown does seem to work.
Well, I mean, these are all very, very difficult trade-offs, and that's why I just wish the government would be much more honest and straightforward about the nature of some of those trade-offs. But if you take something like mental health, I think it was Adrian James, who's a leading figure in the Royal College of Psychiatrists, he said yesterday he thinks that this is going to be catastrophic for the nation's mental health. And it's not just the lockdown, it's the whole situation. It's the economic damage that's being done. It's the young people who are, you just think of the mental health consequences. We worry about students the whole time, but think what it's been like in universities, where you go to university and then you're told, actually, you can't go out and it's all online. Children at the moment who are at home on holiday, being told, on school holiday, being told that, you know, they've got to stay in and they can't go out and see their friends. And at the same time, the same minister goes on television and says, you've got to go to school and don't worry about that. So I think that what I don't see in the government, and I know they've got a lot on their plate, I completely accept that, but I don't see the mental health of the nation even remotely on the agenda. And I do think that I've always felt that the one good thing that might come out of this is a different approach to mental health, much more focused on the preventive. But I don't see that happening in the UK government at all.
No, and as you say, you know, particular concern for children at the moment. Now, Naya, there's lots of talk in the papers today about whether the start of the term for children going back to school should be delayed. You look at one hand on these rising figures. We know that the new variant spreads particularly quickly and easily between children. On the other hand, there are those people who are saying, you know, we're talking there about the mental health of children, that actually, you know, they need to be back in school. It's important for their learning. It's important for their mental health for them to be in that provision.
Yeah, you know, I think at some points in this pandemic, on several points, young people have been blamed. But I think actually, from my perspective, young people may have been hit some of the hardest by this pandemic. And, you know, unfortunately, scientists are not democratically accountable. They kind of give knowledge and expertise in their specific field. Kind of politicians have to triangulate over several different issues, and some of those will be kind of education, the learning of children, that again is something that is needed and necessary for their own personal development, but the development of the country as we come out of this pandemic situation as well. And we talked about mental health, kind of socialization for young people is essential, and in many ways that's fundamentally part of being young, being able to do things and spend time with your friends and learn and grow. And so these things fundamentally need to be considered, and therefore I very much understand the government's desire to do everything that it can to keep schools open, because young people's education is something that should not be delayed or disrupted lightly, especially after a year of that disruption already.
Alastair, you said you were hoping that something positive would come out of COVID, and that could be mental health. Were you referring to the fact that children and adults can't get access to mental health? I mean, I've done an investigation on it a couple of years ago, and there were children who were suicidal who weren't able to get mental health assistance because they were being turned away because they didn't reach the threshold. And that was before COVID. Is that where you see that there could be an improvement, that actually mental health services will be funded properly because we have a crisis on our hands other than COVID?
Well, I'd like to believe that was the case. I'm afraid I don't trust this government to do that, because I think they have other priorities that aren't focused on the mental health of the nation. But I was thinking much more about what we could do with mental health. And by the way, there should be more funding. Don't get me wrong. I'm absolutely with you on that. And child and adolescent mental health services in most of the country are in a state of absolute close to collapse. I'm talking much more about what we can do on the preventive side. So, for example, in schools, actually, not pre-COVID, just as a matter of normal times, are we looking after the mental health and well-being of children, and how that then relates to issues like sport and exercise and diet and family relationships and so forth. But then also, and this is why I think the anti-stigma campaign is so important, which, by the way, the government has stopped funding, can we get to a place where, in being open about our mental health, we actually then, as businesses, communities, colleges and so forth actually can look after each other much better. So I'm thinking, yes, more funding absolutely has to happen, but I'm not holding my breath. And therefore, we may have to try to kind of change the lens on it so that we're much more focused on looking after ourselves in a much more preventive way.
And Alastair, you mentioned Brexit earlier on. I mean, we can't leave without a word on that, can we? Because the MPs are being recalled tomorrow to vote on it. Looking at the details, you know, there is anger in the fishing industry. We see today on the front page of The Guardian, Keir Starmer facing a growing Labour revolt on Brexit. And there are those commenting on the fact that, you know, this is only going to take a day, whereas if you look at how many days of debate there were for the Maastricht Treaty, that was 25 days. What do you make of all the latest on what's going on with Brexit?
Well, funny enough, call me a sado, but yesterday I was looking at some of the coverage of the Maastricht Treaty, which I covered as a journalist for the Mirror. And it wasn't just the 25 days of debate in Parliament, it was the thousands of hours of debate, kind of line by line. And I just think it's part of the scandal of the whole thing. I mean, you know, Femi, who you have sometimes have on your programme, he produced an absolutely brilliant 10-minute video, which he's just posted on social media last night, going through the lies, let's call them what they are, one by one that Boris Johnson told about Brexit. And now, a 1,246-page treaty, I am 2/3 of the way through. It is incredibly complicated. There are hundreds of difficult loose ends, and we're going to have one day's debate, at the end of which, on the 1st of January, we're going to be into this whole new relationship. And nobody can tell me that that is democratic. You can talk about the will of the people all you want. And for the Labour Party, I find it astonishing that the Labour Party, which, by the way, opposed Maastricht, and it opposed Maastricht under Neil Kinnock because of the social chapter opt-out, this trade and security arrangement will do more damage to the lives and livelihoods of the people that Labour Party has as its supporters now and is looking to have as its supporters in the future than the opt-out on social chapter did. And I cannot for the life of me understand why the Labour Party is going to co-own what I believe is going to be a catastrophe for the country.
Inaya, it's not democratic?
Well, you know, Alastair was one of the most fervent kind of anti-Brexit campaigners, so it's no surprise that he will oppose this deal. And obviously, you know, that's completely fine. At the end of the day, from the perspective of the Labour Party, they lost the Red Wall seats. And so maybe there is a recognition that actually Labour should pretty much just learn to love Brexit.
But that aside, it's not. What about that point that it's not democratic? They've got one day to talk about this and decide.
Oh, I think it, you know, I mean, even Nigel Farage, which is one of the biggest kind of Brexit campaigners, has accepted that perhaps this deal may be, you know, a decent negotiation. There are issues there, but the Conservatives not too long ago won an 80-seat majority based off of the premise to kind of get Brexit done. And so the deal that they put forward, you know, I think many people that voted for them would regard this as a kind of democratic decision, which was for them to implement.
I'll tell you what, Anaya, if Nigel Farage has read the 1,246 pages, I am absolutely amazed that he's backing it. If you remember him going down the Thames, throwing fish into the river and telling us all, the fishermen, if they get sold out, I will sort of, you know, stand up and die in a ditch for them. They have been sold out. The people of Northern Ireland have been sold out, although they can get benefits from it, but they were told there'd be no difference between the Northern Ireland and Great Britain and the regime for them. There are. They were told, the Brexiteers, people like Farage, were told that there'd be no chance of the European Union and the European Commission having any impact upon what we do in the future. It's there in the agreement. And I've got a horrible, sneaky suspicion that there have been a few little side deals done and that we should take a very careful look in future at the honours list, because I think there might have been a bit of that going on, which is why some of these very voluble Brexit people have suddenly gone very, very quiet.
The devil could be in the detail when it comes to that, couldn't it? We'll have to leave it there. But Alastair and I, thank you both very much for joining us this morning. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.